Although Brian did get a great transcript of the last meeting.
Hey, it's all the Google, man.
That was very entertaining.
Isn't it?
It was, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think I say too much.
we all do. We all do. I had to go to court one time and I was reading the transcript after, and I'm like, oh boy. You realize how good, like a good politician or somebody is who can really do all that stuff without, having
So
all
the trick there is you don't go back and listen to it. You know what you said already. You're good.
They made me do it. I didn't want to listen to it.
Do we want to approve the minutes first and then we'll get right into
Oh, yeah,
Patrick's presentation?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented in the packet.
Okay, can I get a second?
I'd second it, but I wrote them, so.
That's okay.
I'll second them. They were really good.
Got it.
Any discussion? Comments?
A big thank you for doing them again, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Don't mind.
All right, guess we do a roll call vote. So Catherine,
Yes.
Brian,
Yes.
Patrick,
I didn't attend, so I guess I abstain.
and I vote yes, so they pass.
What about Eric Falconer?
Is he on the call?
I think so. His name is on the screen.
Oh,
You might be
He's not-
muted. Let's look here.
All right,
No, he's live. I just might be.
is he?
Yeah, I
All
don't
right.
see a muted mic symbol or anything. So
It says he's muted, but he should be able to hear us. Eric, are you there?
yeah, that just. All right,
Okay.
maybe later.
Yeah.
He might have stepped away.
Oh, that's enough for approval, so I'll have to take it on that. You want to go right into the presentation, Patrick?
Sure. First of all, I apologize for being a couple weeks late. I injured my back and I was down and out for 2 weeks. Could not do anything. So
behind that.
that being said, after the prior meeting, there's a lot of moving parts. We walked through the performer. So the objective here is to evaluate the solutions that are available to us to address the broadband needs of the community, take a look at the fiber to the home constructs, numbers of leveraging Casco Bay Advisors performer, assess the capital, operational, and cost model benefits and risk, because they all are a little bit different. Then I read the Spectrum franchise to take a look at what the language, terms, and conditions in the franchise are. So we'll talk about that. And just a high-level competitive offering just to see, how we line up against what's being offered at what price point. And then, whatever the next steps are. So the scope of this, limited to broadband service, so no voice, no video. Primary focus is on the town of Reedfield, although looking at the economy of scale for our multi-community coalition type approach. So what I did was break down a visual representation of each of the models and define the demarcation points. Really important to understand that as to who owns what, both from a capital perspective, but operational as well. And did a assessment of the pros, cons, and risks of each. So then I'll walk through, a summary of the variance between the models, number assessment of the capital and operational cost, and then a little more on the Spectrum franchise agreement. So I found some stuff in there. So thought we'd jump right to slide 3. So this is a single provider model. So really the models right now are three-dimensional: single provider, multi-provider or open network, and then a spectrum solution. So this single provider model is based on the Casco Bay pro forma and their assessment. So essentially, when you look at all the building blocks of the network provider essentially just delivers service. The town is responsible for the IP transit, the router aggregators, the OLTs, so the optical transmitter receivers. So those have to be housed somewhere. So more has to be assessed on that.
So is that like the equivalent to the central office type equipment that's been referenced?
Right.
Okay.
So whether it's a co-location with whomever this single provider is, let's just say they're at a data center in Augusta, right? So we meet them there, put our rack of equipment next to theirs, and connect to each other. Or the other potential option is a brick and mortar facility, relatively small, maybe in the town office, whatever the case may be, and the network provider brings their service to that location. But in any case, the town purchases the equipment, maintains it, or third-party contract maintenance, and then any upgrades, technology improvements and so forth is all owned by the town. And then the network plant, in this case, fiber from that location to the subscriber's service pole is all capitalized and maintained by the town. So obviously, that's all third-party contracts. Then the house line to the home is also owned and maintained by the town. So it's part of the initial installation fee, installation fees post whatever the period is, 6 months, 12 months after the network's built. The new subscriber may contribute to that. However, that model gets molded when the time comes. But if there's any damage to these lines, trees coming down, ice storms, anything like that, the town owns the maintenance and repair of the house line homes, also known as house drops. Then the optical transition equipment. So this is the device within the subscriber or customer's home that transitions the signal from light to electrical signal, and then the Wi-Fi connects to that. Now in the Casco Bay model, the provider is providing this equipment, maintaining it, which makes a lot of sense because it's just not a box. These devices have to run off a operating system, have to run off a server. They have configuration files, multi-configuration files for that matter. And the manufacturer will have, ongoing code updates and so forth that somebody has to update the servers and then push those codes out to these devices. So it makes sense for the network provider to own those devices. And then the last piece of the puzzle is the home Wi-Fi. In the case of the Casco Bay model, the customer owns the purchase of the Wi-Fi equipment, maintaining the Wi-Fi equipment, or replacing it. That's a bit of a challenge. I mean, it sounds straightforward, but when you get into customer service, technical support, and troubleshooting, there's a lot of moving parts, and how much will the customer be willing to, troubleshoot their own router, and then there's a challenge troubleshooting whether it's the ONU or the customer's Wi-Fi versus the drop. It gets complicated. Not a great customer experience. That's why most providers provide the Wi-Fi device for the customer's home, which whatever model we move forward with, if we move forward, I would recommend that whomever the provider is, that is an integrated device. All right,
Patrick, can I interrupt you for a quick moment?
you sure can.
So I heard from a new town resident who also happens to be our new code enforcement officer that he had really crappy internet from Spectrum when he first moved onto his property down on Torrey Shores. So he got in touch with Spectrum, and after a while they came out and they found a couple problems in the line, and it was better, but it wasn't great. So the guy came in the house and he said, "That is the crappiest router that we provide. Go get your own router," which he did. And now he told me he has 500 MPS down coming in. And I was like, wow. So there is the opportunity, as you had pointed out, for people to have really good service from Spectrum, all dependent on if you can get them there to troubleshoot and, give you advice on what will work best. So I thought that was really interesting.
And who was that? The new code enforcement officer?
Yeah, Chip Stevens.
Yes, he was actually right over here today, looking at a tree for me.
Ah,
I met him today, yep.
great guy. So, I see where some people would want another router depending on how good the one you're providing is. So I guess the lesson there would be, if you're going to provide them for everybody, you want to provide something that's going to provide the service you're advertising.
Exactly. And there's another dimension to the customer devices, right? You could be getting a half a gig through this Wi-Fi, but the customer's iPad, laptop, whatever the case device might be, may not be capable of that kind of bandwidth. So there's a lot of variables, but the more integrated these devices are, the better. That way there's one single owner, single source of updating code, fixing bugs, and so forth, as well as troubleshooting.
So Patrick, I
Thank
do
you.
have a question about that end equipment as well, because I do have service through Consolidated, and I believe that the Wi-Fi is integrated into their router. Does that make, or not the router, but the their control box? Is that
Yeah, it's a single device, yeah.
okay?
integrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That works
But
really
the
well for
Casco-
us.
Yeah, it's simpler, it's easier for the end user, and it's a lot easier to troubleshoot.
So the ONU and the Wi-Fi is one unit.
It could be.
Could be. Okay.
What was in the pro forma from Casco Bay was that the ONU and the Wi-Fi device were separate units.
Okay.
So something to think about.
Yeah.
All right, so any other questions on the single provider model?
Yeah, I just got one. What does ONU stand for? I missed that.
Optical
Network unit?
unit, yeah. Sorry, there's like 10 different acronyms for that.
It's fine.
That's not one I use in our industry, but that's the one being used by Casco Bay, so I carried it.
Well, what would you refer to it as?
An optical node, OTN, optical transition
Okay,
network.
it's good to know the terminology from all directions.
Yeah, there's probably 5 or 6 others, depending on industry and manufacturer. So essentially, at a high level, the town carries most of the capital and the operational cost. Network provider is just connecting to our network and providing the ONUs. So by and large, the town is carrying a majority of the cost and the risk, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, for a single provider. So an open network. So if we're going to have, a network built by the town, by the residents, however it's financed, why restrict it to one owner? I mean, one provider? Why not open it up to all providers? So I'll give you an example. And you don't see this much anymore, but third-party providers, let's just say GWI wanted to provide service to a customer in Reedfield. Their only option would be to lease a DSL circuit from Consolidated. And they would pay Consolidated that monthly fee, and then they would charge their customer their fees on top of that. You don't see that much anymore, only in that DSL just can't compete with cable-based broadband. So a lot of these providers are either building their own networks, like GWI has in Brunswick, Lewiston, Oxford Networks. If it makes sense, they'll build their own network, but they won't lease the DSL circuit anymore because it just can't compete. So same model, same demarcation points. The difference here being, you've got provider 1, 2, and 3, or whatever the number of providers are. And in a model like this, I'd put town space, but most likely this would be a co-location center, so a data center. Most likely there's a couple in Augusta. And all those providers are probably in that data center. So we being the town would have to lease some space, put our equipment in that space, and then there'd be some connection fees between each provider and our network. So again, in this case, the optical node unit really should be owned by the provider, only in that it's tied to the billing system. So these ONUs have to be provisioned. So they're a dumb box out of the box. So there has to be configuration files to tell it what to do and how to work and what light frequency is being used and all those kind of things, right? So it would make sense for each of the providers to provide their own ONU to their customers. And again, integrated with Wi-Fi is really the best solution. The difference here is, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, when I touched on third-party providers leasing DSL circuits, they did it for decades. And they leased ISDN circuits, and sometimes they would even lease a T1 to provide service to a customer. So they're accustomed to doing that. That's kind of the model. If you're not a facilities provider, facilities being owning your own network, your only other option is to lease capacity or lease a circuit from a facility provider. So there's a potential opportunity here, but it also comes with its own set of risks. So that's the only difference between the open model and the single provider model. And if we can get co-located in a data center, there could be 8 or 10 different providers that might be connected to that data center. And the cost of them delivering service to a resident in Reedfield would be relatively minimal. It's not going to drive up their operating costs by any means, but they would have to have a provisioning system for the ONUs. All right, any questions on the open provider model?
So in that case, the customer cost on a monthly recurring basis is to the service provider they're hooked up with?
Right, the service provider bills the customer. But again, it's another layer of complexity, but the town would have to bill the service provider for each circuit.
Okay.
Providers using to get to a customer. So that can offset operational cost. Versus a single model, single provider model, that provider, whomever it is, based on the Casco Bay model, they don't pay any fees. They get to use the network essentially at no charge. So a little different approach.
Yep.
Okay.
Patrick, is it fair to say in both of these models, the town is kind of like Central Maine Power, that we're doing T&D, other people are doing supply, and in one model you just have single supply like old school Central Maine Power, versus nowadays you can pick if you want to buy solar from somebody, you can do that, or is that?
That's a great, yeah, that's a great analogy.
Okay.
Perfect analogy. It's exactly what it is. All right, and then the last, if there's no other questions on the open provider model. we can always come back to it because we're going to dive into it a little bit in more detail. The last one is the Spectrum model. So as you can see depicted here, Spectrum owns all the capital and operational costs, provides all the equipment, essentially end-to-end solution provider. And the town of Reedfield does receive a 5% of gross revenue on the cable revenue as a franchise fee. So that's different than the other models. No idea what that annual payment has been. Eric, do you have any idea what that revenue each year looks like?
There we go. Had muted myself. Right around 30 to 32,000, I think, is where we've been.
Okay.
Now, Patrick, you say it's on the cable revenue. Does Spectrum have other revenue that they're receiving from customers in Reedfield?
Yeah, they'll receive revenue on their voice services and their video, I'm sorry, their internet services. But the 5% franchise fee is FCC Cable Act based. 96, I think, was the last revision of it. And the franchise fee is, and the franchise itself is all based on video. So in other words, if and the lines are getting really blurred, as you know, right? Because a lot is being transmitted over IP. But if another provider wanted to come into Reedfield and build their own network, and they only were providing internet and voice, no video, they wouldn't need a franchise. They wouldn't need an agreement with the town to use their rights of way. I don't know if they could ride CMP rights of way any longer. I think that went away years ago, but not up to date on main law around that. But they wouldn't need a franchise agreement unless they were providing video.
Okay.
All right, so, in summary, this is kind of a summary of about everything, we've talked about. But I think, under the single provider, looking at the bullets, as I said, the town assumes all, capital construction costs and operational costs. And that single provider model, the residents don't have a choice of providers. So we're very dependent on whomever that single provider is. What are they offering for products, what features, what apps? We're talking 20 years here. So who knows what the technology of tomorrow is going to be? Are they going to be able to keep up and be competitive in the marketplace? If not, the subscription base will drop off and erode. And we already talked about the customer or the subscriber owning the Wi-Fi device and maintaining it. But I think the big call out is the town assumes a majority of the financial risk. So you got to make sure that it's priced right. Got to make sure you get the penetration of customers that have access to the network, and then the operational cost, have to be somewhere within reason of the pro forma, or some other type of solution in the event costs do exceed expectations or forecast. So fair amount of risk. The open provider, again, the town assumes a majority of the financial risk. We don't pay the ISP cost, but at least the open provider, or the number of providers in an open provider model, may be paying a fee to access the network or use the network to get to the residents or customers. So that does help, offset that cost as well as reduce the risk. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anything else we haven't talked about. The previous 3 slides were visual. This is more, informational.
So of course, in the Spectrum list, the resident doesn't have a choice of provider there either.
No, they don't. Correct.
Okay.
Now, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Spectrum does have a low income product offering at $22.95. It's actually $17.95. And if the customer wants Spectrum to provide the Wi-Fi at that unit, that would be another $5. So that's why I put $22.99. I'm not sure how many residents are aware of that. It's something that gets advertised, that's for sure.
Right.
Yeah, do you know what the
Isn't-
threshold is for that? The income threshold? Any idea?
I don't. I don't.
I can ask. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a form you have to fill out online, and then somebody contacts you. So I didn't go all the way down that path.
Yeah.
Is that the one that you listed somewhere else, what the speeds were for that? And wasn't it something like ridiculously slow?
Yeah, I
Like
think it was
three.
like 3 megs. Yeah.
Right. So that's not really helpful for, say, a family who's very poor, who has students in school who are all trying to do video at the same time.
Right. It doesn't qualify for the definition of broadband.
Okay.
But I
So
did put that in there because I know there was some, there may be concern with some residents having the ability to even have access at all.
Yeah.
Just wasn't sure if residents are aware of this. And I don't know, maybe if in the newsletters, that might be something worthy of including, just to, along with a link. There's a link on the Spectrum website that, people might be able to take advantage of that they're not even aware of.
that would be good, but I'd like to put the price in, the income threshold too, so that they don't get inundated with requests for something and they're not qualifying. So if you get that information, Eric, that would be great.
Yeah, if we can get that from Spectrum, all I can tell you is online on their website is you have to fill out a form and then they get back to you. So there's a table of, income versus, qualify or do not qualify. Wish it was that simple, but I didn't spend a lot of time on it and I didn't make any phone calls.
That's okay. We'll follow up on that one. Brian sent us the link.
The link, but in very quickly, it just says for requirements, one or more members of your house has to be a recipient of like National School Lunch Program, community eligibility provision, or supplemental security income for people over 65. But yeah, it's actually 30 megabits per second. So that's not too bad, though. It does say wireless speed may vary. So if it's actually 30, that's not too bad. But Patrick, that's great to make that option more available. You think Spectrum would be ringing the bell on that, but maybe they prefer people don't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
Eric, you can easily get, this is Eric Dyer. You can easily get that school lunch figure from the RSU for Just Reed Field. They have all that data available and it's public.
All right. I'll reach out to them.
Not necessarily which family they wouldn't tell you, but they can tell you the number because that's how they get a lot of their funding.
It's something like it's like 1 out of 6 or something. No, that can't be right. 1 out of, yeah. We were just talking about this not long ago, but the food bank in Reedfield was really slammed last spring and people were surprised, but there's a lot of folks that need help. They'd be happy to get this probably.
Yeah, and they may be paying full freight right now because it's such a need. So even though it's not, linked to expanding network accessibility, but certainly affordability.
It's definitely a goal. Yeah.
Well, and in a backwards kind of way, you sort of hit upon a metric that you can use without being specific to individuals that says, well, how many people are on school lunch? You can kind of forecast that out. So that's interesting. It's good.
And it's 30 megabits, he said. So my apologies. We'll get to that slide, but if I left off the 0, that my mistake. So here's a table of benefits and success dependencies are really important for each model. So we've already talked about the benefits of a single model. It's simpler, it's one provider, it's little more straightforward, but you're really dependent on that provider offering a compelling product and keeping pace with the industry, keeping pace with the subscriber needs, which is going to continue to change over 20 years. And it's also very dependent on, as you know, the residents supporting the funding of the build out of the network. And the penetration rate, the model at 40% going, hitting less than that, it's going to become problematic. We talked about the Wi-Fi, and we also have to take into account that other providers like Spectrum and Consolidated have bundled pricing. So if the towns or the single provider could provide a product or a service for a lower monthly fee, if there's good possibility if the customer unbundles their internet from their current provider, that their cost may go up. So the cost savings may be eroded. So just something to consider. And, we talked about the network burden being carried by the town, both, capital and operational. There is a risk that residents may view this model as, a taxpayer funded network to the profit of a single provider. So, it's a fair, perspective in light of how that model's set up. So some residents might push back on it. And I think we also have to consider is what happens if that single provider ever goes out of business. The town network could essentially go dark. Hopefully, if that were to happen, there would be a transitional period, and there'd be time to work out another provider. But that could get pretty messy. So just something to consider when you're dependent on a single source.
That's a good point, Patrick. I hadn't really thought about the long-term nature of that commitment to the third-party service provider. And I guess I had always thought that it would be something that could be negotiated or renegotiated or put out to bid. But I guess, it makes sense to have at least probably a 5 or 10 year horizon or contract, right? I don't know if we would necessarily go a full 20 if that was the direction that we ended up heading in, but I hadn't really thought about what is that time frame, right? What's the horizon for a relationship with a service provider? Because I wouldn't want to be changing out my gear probably even every 5 years, right? They should be updating it anyway, but it doesn't always happen that way. But that's just an interesting perspective. I appreciate you bringing that in.
Yeah, and, 5 year might be a little short because you really should start negotiating the new contract 24 months before the end of the term. So that would leave a 3-year window because if you get into that renewal discussion and you could potentially get it into an impasse with a provider, now you got to find.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think too, you looked more closely at the franchise agreement than I haven't looked at it for a few years now. I looked at it briefly with some of this broadband discussion, but it's and we'll talk about that later, right? But it's no longer active. But I think that had a 12-year. Was there a 12-year horizon on that on the franchise?
Yeah, it was 12-year.
12-year. Okay. All right. Yep. Good.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that Spectrum is having a problem with us in the same way that you're pointing out we could have a problem with a single provider, in that they're not keeping pace with the needs of the residents in town. People want faster internet speeds. They want various products offered that aren't being offered. And so I think we have that same risk with a single provider such as Spectrum.
Yep.
I think the only way you get past that is when you have multiple providers.
Yeah, when you've got some competition, there's incentive for the providers to keep up.
Yeah, and Consolidated really has fallen apart because they don't have much fiber. So they're doing everything through their old phone lines. And
right.
Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the language in the franchise that could require Spectrum to keep pace.
Good.
So we'll get into that in a little bit. The multi-provider model, again, the benefits are customers have a choice. You're not dependent on one provider. If one provider goes out of business, you can always, customers can always transition to another provider. So it does, have several beneficial qualities. However, it is, dependent on a simplified provider agreement. So we've got, there's going to have to be some, legal time spent on this, but these agreements have to be consistent. There can't be any, most favored nation clauses. It's got to be pretty cut and dry, but it also has to protect the community and the residents and the customers. And it's, also dependent on, multiple providers wanting to access the network. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. It shouldn't be free. They don't get on anybody's network free, but nonetheless, will providers be interested in connecting, to the network? And when you get into a multi-town network, that can be an additional incentive for some of these providers, particularly if all these towns are co-located in the same location. But the risk of the multi-provider is we got to, the town would have to get either that co-location space, let's just say data center in Augusta, or provide space locally. In that case, the providers would have to transport their network to the town's meet-me point. So there'd be some cost associated with that might drive down some of the interest. So there's a bit of a balance there. And it can get a little complicated with, technical support for the end users. So that customer experience and all the handoffs between the networks. But it's doable, but it's something that has to be well mapped out with each of the providers so that customers aren't caught in the middle. And then Spectrum, well, from what I can see in the documentation, 94% of the residents have access to it. The franchise agreement does have some provisions regarding unserviced, areas. And it appears that the franchise agreement is expired. If Eric, what you sent me is the most recent version.
That's correct. Yeah, it's been expired for 7 years, 8 years. It's been quite a while. Yeah.
Well, legal precedent in my experience is it's in effect. Neither party is pushing back, so all the terms and conditions of the original agreement are still binding. I'd
say generally they did balk when I asked them to put a connection to the transfer station. They made me pay for a hookup, but maybe I didn't argue enough.
And the dependency there is as far as being successful leveraging the franchise, you got to hold them accountable to the terms and conditions of the agreement. They could take the legal position that we're not going to extend service as written in the franchise because it's expired, so let's negotiate a new franchise agreement. And we'll talk about that language in that renegotiation, and that could get dragged out for an extended period of time. They could take that position, but I think the town probably has a pretty good standing that A, there's precedent, and B, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, as to whether or not they have delivered on any of the extension provisions in the agreement to date.
Eric, I think you asked a couple years ago if they would do any build out, and they said, no way, no how, no time. Am I remembering that pretty correctly?
I don't think that's quite right. I've never actually negotiated with Spectrum on anything other than, like I said, trying to get I guess I'll back up. They did start charging us for service at the town office, and when I stopped paying them, they shut the service off. So that was an unsuccessful negotiation on our part. And then most recently, like I said, I did ask them to provide service at the transfer station, and they said, "Well, we don't do that anymore. Even though it's part of the agreement, we're not going to do that." And again, that was me talking to the guy that does their sales. So I don't believe I probably got to the right person in the right way. But one of the things that we've I guess we haven't put money into approaching this from a legal perspective. We haven't gone after them with lawyers, which is about, I think, the only thing that would be effective. Although with the current environment, and I think Patrick's pointing to this, they're much more willing to negotiate than they have been in the past. And I think, and that's probably true in all areas, for the service they provide through the cable, as well as any other service they might be willing to put forward. And I do know that the town of Leeds is starting to negotiate with Spectrum for gap filling, and they said they've had some reasonable responses, but it hasn't really been that good of an offer. But again, that's just through the grapevine, through the WKLCBA contacts that we have. But I guess long story short is, we haven't been successful to date in getting much out of them, but it doesn't mean that we're trying in the right way, if that makes any sense. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who you spoke to, but if they had their franchise agreement, they said, yeah, it's in there, but we don't do that anymore.
that's what the guy told me. I said, we've got a franchise agreement, and he said, yeah, we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, okay. Let me talk to your boss. Typically, something from legal gets their attention, but there is a path going to their government relations or their government affairs teams. And right now, timing's pretty good, because I think the last thing they would want is a complaint, to, I don't know, let's just say the FCC or the Attorney General, that they're not complying with the franchise, and here you are, potentially distributing funds to Spectrum to expand rural broadband. And that was kind of sloppily worded, but I think you get the gist of it.
I do, yeah, yeah.
Do we know what it would cost if we've got so-called like 94% build out? What the 6% remaining was? Was it like 100 and I didn't think it was a huge number. Am I wrong?
He's got it in here.
We'll get to that in a minute. We'll get into it in a little more detail, actually. So let's just look at the numbers of the single provider. I mean, we've talked about this. The actual cost of service is $109 a month based on the performer. I think it's important that we understand exactly what it costs to deliver. However, 40% penetration at $70 a month would be a break even on the operating cost. So no real change there. But if you go to the open provider model, I did two constructs. One with what's the break even for construction and operating costs. And there's really no path to that number. It would take 6% penetration at $90 a month, with a circuit per subscriber fee to third party providers of $50 a month to get to that break even point. And it's just not something that I think is realistic. But I thought I would put it on there just to get all the numbers on one table. Here's what it would take. So an open provider break-even operating model, our operating costs, go down because they're bringing their ISP, they're providing, they're not charging the town fees, per subscriber. Basically, the operating cost is essentially the network maintenance and the reserve fund for future capital improvements and so forth. But some of the other costs go away, So the operating cost is, pretty flat at $42,000 a month, which could be, reduced to $19,000 a month, assuming that third-party providers would pay a $35 per circuit or per customer fee to access customers, and that they would bill somewhere in the $70 range to be competitive. That would, 40% penetration at those rates would get us at a break even on the operating cost and reduce a lot of risk. But it does come with the requirement that the town would have to have a billing system and a periodic audit and some type of reporting from the third-party providers, just to make sure, all the dots connect and the right people being charged for the use of the network.
Hey, Patrick, when I'm looking at that rightmost column, the cost of service per customer, is that saying it's $35.70 a month that the customer pays? Or is that?
It actually had 40% penetration, so 532 customers. The cost, because the third-party providers would be paying a circuit fee, the cost per customer to the town goes down essentially in half.
All right. So what, under that particular example, do you have an idea what the customer themselves might pay? Because I think everything we talk about is going to come back down to somebody pulling their bill out and looking at it and say, well, can I do it cheaper with the town, or is it faster, or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a fair question, right? Let's just say you have 3 third-party providers, and they're each are paying a $35 circuit fee per customer. Some of those providers might charge $80 for 1 gig. Another might charge 100. Another might charge 60. Right? But you've got competition, so the competition for the customer should pretty much even out the service provider fee. But the assumption here is it would be around $70. The circuit fee could be lower than 35. I don't think it's going to be any higher. You could get interest with anything higher than 35. But at the end of the day, with that, whatever that number is, it lowers the operational cost to the town and reduce risk. So a model to consider. And then we have the Spectrum franchise agreement. So Eric confirmed that is in fact expired. Section 231 stipulates the grantor has the option to require extension of service 1 mile per every 2-year period, regardless of density. The franchise requires them to build out to 18 homes per mile, but every 2 years, the town can elect 1 mile extension regardless of density. So on a 12-year term, that's 6 miles. Do we know if this provision has ever been exercised?
We don't. I have no idea. So one of the things, like I said, we haven't gone to Spectrum. We haven't, and I certainly don't have the institutional knowledge because I've been here for about 5 years. So I don't know if that was ever exercised. And I really don't know. I guess I think I kind of agree with your expectation that if we were to go to Spectrum and try to get them to exercise any of this, they'd say, well, this is expired, we need to renegotiate. And I think that's been one of the holdups that we've had, at least as a town, in pursuing this is, it's working, and we haven't until this point even wanted to consider renegotiating because the word on the street and what was happening in the legislature gave a pretty strong indication that Spectrum was not interested in negotiating. But things have changed dramatically, as you know, in the past year.
Well, I certainly would expect them to take that position. The position the town could take is we'd be happy to talk about a new franchise agreement, once you've lived up to the terms and conditions of your existing agreement, because if you don't, maybe you won't have one. And I mean, that's
Yep,
kind of direct and to the point, but
it certainly is,
to
yeah.
that coin, right? So generally, as I said, the government affairs, the government relations group are the ones that will act upon those type of requests. So even on the 12-year term, 6 miles, if it's again, we don't know if it's ever been exercised. Spectrum should have some documentation to back that up if they claim it has. But just the precedent of the agreement still being in effect and all terms and conditions, being valid and in effect, it's been 23 years. So under that provision, there'd be as much as 11.5 miles the town could elect to request.
Yeah, and that'd be more than enough to cover that gap. I mean, we're talking
Yeah.
5%, and with road miles in town, we've probably got, oh, I can't remember what this was, it 100 something like that. If you added up all the private roads and everything, it's not crazy.
Yeah, I think it was like 4.8 miles of unserviced roads, and again, that's road miles, so might be a little bit higher than that. But even more interesting is section 231D stipulates that the grantor could request extension into lower density areas if the customers or subscribers were willing to contribute the cost equal to the difference to the 18 homes per mile. So on the right here, I'm assuming again the 4.8 miles in the pro forma, 83 homes equates to 17.3. It's pretty close. So assuming 45,000 a mile at 4.8 miles, 216,000, 2,500 per home. So the 83 homes would equate to, normally Spectrum would cover 207,000. So the difference would be 8,500 that the customer could contribute. And that's a collective 83 homes. Now, I don't think anybody really cares where the check comes from. So if the town of Reedfield decided that they were going to contribute the 8,500 to cover the gap between 18 homes per mile and 17.3, I don't think that makes a difference. I think the only thing that makes a difference here logistically is that this section refers to the contributor as a subscriber. So this would mean that these 83 homes would have to subscribe to service in order for this section to be leveraged. However, there's nothing in the language as to the required length of term for the customer to be.
So they could sign up and then drop the service.
Hey, doesn't say you can't.
Yep.
I think this is something along the lines of what Joe McLean, Eric from the Leeds rep to the WKLCBA has said that they're looking at with Spectrum.
Yeah, I think
Is
that
it the town?
yeah, it sounds very similar. I think they were saying that they were going to charge the town a premium of like $30 a month or something like that. They're working on something that's similar to this, basically a town buyout of any kind of obligation, or maybe just a buy-in to have them extend the service. But no, you're absolutely right. They're working on that, and yeah, we should be talking to Leeds about what they're doing as well.
Right, I'm sure they would share that information with us, and that's something that Patrick would probably be able to decipher for us as to validity and viability.
Yeah, and if there's provisions in the Reedfield franchise agreement that Spectrum is not abide to, chances are the same will be the case in other communities. And sometimes power and numbers make a difference. So, and I'm not saying you ring the fire alarm, but talking to other communities and is probably a pretty good idea because that also bridge with Spectrum if they start hearing from 3, 4, 5 communities about this type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it wouldn't hurt to have your local legislator say, why aren't you honoring the deal here? Yeah, Patrick, could somebody, could a private homeowner say, it's worth it to me to have I'll chip in $2,000 to get this down my street. You know, what's the case here? It said if $8,500 was the gap, say, but for one neighborhood, it's only a couple grand. And the reason I'm asking that is because in our neighborhood, we only have 5 houses, but we have this long road that goes, it's like 1,000 feet or so, but it's all underground utilities. So when we talked to Spectrum like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they said, yeah, if you guys run it underground, we'll take it aerial the rest of the way. So we did that. So our road association chipped in money to make that extension, and they extended it the rest of the way aerial. So it's great ever since. So that, and I only bring that up because there may be a couple areas where people are like, well, I didn't even know we could do that. And
Right.
road would chip in, $500-600 per family just to have freaking good internet, right? So it's a good question. I'm glad that Leeds is kicking off those conversations, and it does seem like we're in a decent negotiating position now that there's options, and the WKL CBA has some strength in numbers, as you mentioned. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and versus an all-in view of the 4.8 miles, 83 homes, 17.3 a mile, on a case by case, the way the language is written is the extension to that one home or group of 5 homes, whatever that cost is, and how would it equate to extrapolate to 18 homes per mile. That's what Spectrum would cover. The balance would be covered by the resident or residents that are requesting service. So it will be different, in a case by case scenario. And as I mentioned here in the second to last bullet, these are all really short extensions. So I really don't think they're going to look anything like $45,000 a mile. I think 2/3 of them look like they're probably going to be in the 20-ish, maybe even lower. And that's a leap of faith, that there's not a lot of unseen or documented logistics involved that, aren't seen right now. But I guess the short of it is these are not major extensions. They're probably going to run less than 45,000 a mile. But using the math in the franchise, the contribution to close the gap between the 17.3 homes per mile of unserved homes to what Spectrum would be required to service if it was 18 homes per mile is pretty small.
We've had feedback from local residents that they've been told it would be $8,000 or $13,000 to bring cable to their home. So I think Spectrum is just completely disregarding any obligation that may be in writing. And so I think they just need some strong input.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see the bill of material. I'd like to see the Schedule 1, and maybe some of them are that expensive. So, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not the case, but if there's a feeling that they're just jacking up the estimated cost so they don't have to build it, if there's nobody to keep them in check, then that's what they'll do. And the next slide, it's just a cut and paste right out of the franchise agreement. So you can read and see the language in both the duration, the new technology, and the extension policy we just walked through. The new technology provision would require them to provide similar or capable service that's being offered to at least 30% of the cable systems in the continental US. Comparable in demographics and subscribers to Reedfield. Okay, there's a lot of math there, but end of the day, there is some language here that says, they're providing, they're offering 1 gig service now, 940 megabits. And there are other packages which we'll touch on in a minute. So they do offer it. Obviously, this doesn't state what they would be able to charge for whatever level of service, but nonetheless, whatever the technology is, if it's available in at least 30% of cable systems in the US, comparable to Reed Field, they would have to upgrade. Now, there is a kind of a out clause, if you will, if they deem the technological improvements isn't economically feasible and so on and so forth, that provision, could be not something that they would have to abide by. So it's kind of a give and take there, but at least there's something in there. But today, Consolidated only offers up to 50 megabits a second. You've got to be within 4,500 feet. And that's 4,500 feet, that's lab condition. In the real world, age of copper, moisture, galvanic corrosion, there's all kinds of factors that is going to drive that distance shorter to get 50 megabits. But nonetheless, they're offering it as a service at $56 a month. Their entry level service at 10 megs is $33 a month, and that will go out to 12,000 feet. So, call it a couple miles. They do offer a low income plan of 2 megabits per second at $9.25, pretty low price. Obviously a lot better than dial up, but 2 megs doesn't get you very far, but it does give people connectivity. Spectrum is offering up to 940 megabits, per second. I think you'll see them probably double that in the next 12 to 18 months. I think the cable industry is going to go 2 gig faster than most people expect, and then probably 5 gig within 5 years, 3 to 5 years. So this will always be changing, but they do offer that 30 megabit service for $22.99 for low income. And your third party providers, I'd be surprised if there's any out there. They would have to lease a circuit from Consolidated. Red Zone offers 5 megs at $44. It's a fixed wireless solution, pretty low coverage, pretty high price. And then Trail Runner is a mobile wireless. They're offering 25 megs at $80 a month. And this is just what you can find publicly available. So it's kind of a way of, sizing up the market at a very high level.
Can I ask you about hotspots?
Sure.
So I'm a public school teacher for 31 more days. Not that anybody's counting. Oh yeah, you got it, Brian. And through the Department of Education and then through each local school district, they've been providing hotspots to families that don't have internet connectivity for various reasons. Are those all coming through cell signals when they do these hotspots?
Yeah, most likely. Yeah, most likely it's a cellular solution. Otherwise, Consolidated would have to deliver it, or Spectrum would have to deliver it. I don't know where Spectrum is with their Wi-Fi hotspots. I can tell you Comcast is probably up in the 25 million range of hotspots, but that's for customer use. Spectrum would also be for customer use. I don't know if Spectrum is doing, a similar program like Comcast and building what you would call a hotspot or a community center, lift zones, we call them. Mm-hmm. They're offering and providing service and computers, for those that, need it to have a place to go to, access, the internet and be able to stay connected.
I'm just imagining, I think it's with cell phones, and it's in places that don't have internet. They typically don't have much cell signal either. So it's still a really pretty crappy service. So we have kids that still have to go to the local town library and have sessions with people because it just doesn't provide what they need. And it seems that that's a tremendous cost to the Department of Education. And I know some of it's been provided by the providers as donations, but as the pandemic winds down, these families are then going to lose those hot spots. And we've got a bunch of them here in Reedfield that are doing that. And I think we're going to see a much increased demand because families have now had some access to internet where they didn't have it before, and it's been free. And so I think we're going to see a lot of people wanting something more.
Yep.
So I've been very interested in what you've presented here with trying to hold Spectrum more accountable to the franchise agreement.
Yeah, there's also, it was a little out of context, so I didn't build it in here, but there is provisions in the franchise agreement for a town elected 5-site, what they call an INET. So it's in a connect network, as well as capable of 2-way video. So I'm assuming that's how the town meetings and the select board meetings are, transmitted over the cable system. But it also had some language in there for delivering services to the library and the schools, as well as the town hall. So I'm going to have to pull it out and read further in it. But there may be some leverage there that service would then in turn be your hotspot for residents, to come in and use.
So we could have it in more than one location.
Mm-hmm. I believe it's 5. I just can't
Wow.
recall if it was grantor elected locations or if it specifically called out locations in the town. Now, the town hall may have moved since the franchise was signed, but let me look at it a little bit further.
Town hall's in the same spot.
It is, okay. But I'll look at that a little further and follow up with an email to the group.
Cool.
So do you know if the schools in the library are interconnected through what's called an INET, so an institutional network, so it's data?
They're not through anything Spectrum provides. They are connected through the main
School and library network.
School and library, yeah. Started off as T1s and then they've upgraded and yeah. So, yep, that's how they're connected.
Yeah, but doesn't mean that you can't hold Spectrum accountable for the connection they're supposed to provide. So I'll look at that a little further and follow up.
Yeah, that's a very much appreciated. Again, I really appreciate you taking a look at that piece more specifically, because it is relevant if we can exercise it. And I think that's been just, we've exercised ourselves a restraint in doing that because it's been expired. But this is a good place to jump off to look at that more actively and aggressively too.
Well, and it could provide a solution. Even if we moved forward with a fiber to the home network, it would provide a solution in the interim. And as Patrick has pointed out, with the push all across the nation to build more broadband, you're going to start having supplier issues and increased costs. And so just because we have the funding arranged and all the legal arrangements made doesn't mean that we're going to be able to find someone to actually build it. And so anything we can do in the meantime that's particularly low cost, which, what you were talking about is, I think we have to take advantage of ASAP.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a 2-tiered approach. Low hanging fruit. I'm not saying easy, but easier to execute. Shorter, timeline to execution. We'll touch on this in a minute, but you're right. The supply, the demand and supply for contractor resources is going to become a real challenge across the entire country. There's going to be a lot of startup companies because there's an opportunity there. You don't want a startup company building your network because if it's not built right, it will be a complete nightmare. And I've seen networks that nearly had to be completely rebuilt within 5 years because the original builder didn't build it to spec and there was nobody that checked to make sure they did. So to get a quality provider, it's the rates are going up. And again, it's just supply and demand.
Well, and as you said, there's that you expect to see cable increasing their speeds up to 2 meg and possibly higher in the shorter term, in terms of a 20 or 30-year landscape. 2 to 5 years is pretty short. And where Reedfield has a lot of cable coverage, if they could provide reliable, consistent service, that might be a solution for our town.
Yeah, I mean, in short term, whatever they do, they can take what is and make it better, right? And then, so, parallel lane being those 83 homes that, do not have access to service. So if we can get those two solutioned in the short term, I think all the other solutions are the roadmap is much longer. So I took a shot at high level. What would a community coalition look like? The table at the top is, all the data that is available as to, each town's, miles and coverage and estimated cost and so forth. Reedfield has the highest number of, homes per mile, which works for us, but also works against us when it comes to subsidies and so forth. But we have the least to gain in a multi-community coalition, where the other communities, with much less coverage have more to gain. And I'm not saying it's not worthy of, taking this path, but we just have to understand that, we probably aren't going to see that much of a lift. I broke down the table below without putting numbers to it. There could be, some marginal plant, construction, cost savings, just because you're buying more material. So it's volume discount, if you will, if you had multiple towns and you all ordered the fiber together under, one purchase order from one vendor, somebody would have to manage all that, but nonetheless, you would get better pricing. The same would go for any other third-party contracts as well, but I think those rates are going to go up as we just discussed. But on the operational cost, particularly the per incident, financial impacting items, the home repairs, the damage to the network, tree comes down, ice storm, that type of thing. You're probably not going to see that much of a saving in a multi-town, coalition. Maybe a little, but not enough to say that, hey, this is a game changer. I think the most is going to be on the greatest opportunity is going to be in the network maintenance and the capital improvement upgrades, right? So if we, upgrade or replace a router to a higher capacity router, if it was serving 6 towns and the device is $250,000, well, splitting that 6 ways is, obviously a much better business case than carrying that yourself. So on those network plant maintenance, just because they'll, have a third-party provider, assuming they all use the same provider, it would take a multi-town agreement on all materials, all labor, all contractors, all third-party contracts, all terms and conditions in these contracts. So it's, for it to be effective, everybody would have to be on the same page. I guess the question would then be, how long is it going to take 6 communities to get on the same page?
The answer is it takes a while. Dan and I are part of I don't know, it was a 4 or 5 community wastewater agreement that's been in place since 1970. And just to get that signed, the last time it's taken like 2 years. So, I mean, it's still in effect, but to get the changes made takes ages.
Yeah, it takes time. And again, I'm not saying it's not worthy of pursuing this. I just think we just have to be completely honest and candid with ourselves that this is a long road, because the leads and and Wales might have, completely different ideas of what this multi-community agreement might look like and what it should be focused on. And obviously, they have their needs, which might be different than town of Reedfield. So you got to work through all that and find the common ground. But when it comes to operational costs and capital cost savings, everybody has to be using the same contractor, the same vendors for materials, and then all the operational pieces, plant maintenance, house line maintenance, and so forth. If there's gonna be any kind of savings, it's got to be tied to one vendor.
That is the sticking point with the WKLCBA currently. We're working around that just to get the engineering study done. Reedfield has one and Wayne has one. No, we have the pro forma done.
The pro forma, yeah.
And we're just trying to get a group pro forma done to see if there's any group savings really to doing it as one unit. To have the engineering and the pole make ready phase done. Because what we've been told is that's the only way we can get an RFP ready and get some prices back from actual vendors. And that's what we would have to be able to say to the customers, your residents of each voting town, are you willing to spend this? Because right now it's all just numbers that we're projecting, and you got to have something firm to work on. And we came up against a real tough situation. What was it, Eric? Over 3 weeks, I think. People were just not comfortable talking about things. And I think where I came up with it, or what I took out of that was we had 2 town managers out of 6 towns. That's a discussion that needs to happen with people who have a lot more knowledge than just people serving on a committee. Because the people who have that inside information and all the historical knowledge are the ones who can talk turkey and say this is viable or this would never work. So that could be a really long part of this process. You're right.
Yeah, and if there was a 20% savings going in collectively, and it takes X number of years, it may be worth it. But if we're looking for something shorter term needs, this is probably not going to be it.
So even if you're looking at what the Spectrum uncovered mileage is, and it was $220,000, let's just say round, it's not in front of me. That's something Reedfield could potentially just pay for to get the service out to those 83 homes. Now, I'm not saying we would do that, especially if people weren't going to commit to using it. Why would we spend all that money? And then 4 people took advantage of it.
Right.
So, obviously there's some negotiating you have to do with residents. It's just like every resident who has access to Spectrum is not subscribing.
Right.
And so go ahead.
Go ahead.
So I think there are bigger questions that we have to be able to ask our residents for and get answers from. How many of you subscribe to cable? Because we don't even know how many people are subscribing through Consolidated or Spectrum. We just know what's available.
And the service satisfaction surveys that have been done in the past, was service provider one of the questions? So you could specifically tie subscriber, customer, resident satisfaction with Consolidated versus Spectrum, or is it all just one pool?
It has not been that broken down, but the survey we were going to use, and I'm going to think about that after this meeting now to discuss with Eric how we want to do that. But it would have that information available.
Yeah.
It's a much smarter approach than just saying, how happy are you with your service? Even the question, the way it was asked the first time around, left a lot of speculation or room for interpretation of, your service. Is that, are you happy with the customer service, with the service in general? It was a very kind of round question, and we do need more specificity, definitely.
Well,
It
at
was a
that
real,
point, I think we were just looking for, is it a problem in Reed Field or is it not a problem? And that gave us that base information that it's a problem.
Yeah,
right,
there is that.
right, exactly. It was a problem statement survey.
Right.
So Eric, to your point, getting more granular is going to help understand, okay, where are the trouble spots and with whom? And then how many of these 83 residents, are interested if in fact Spectrum would, extend service to their home.
Is that something that's reasonable for us to just make cold calls or a letter to each of those homes and say, you're a current resident of Reed Field that doesn't have access to broadband. If it were available, would you subscribe?
Yeah, I think that's smart.
Well, I'm not sure we know who they are. That's part of the trouble. I mean, we have I guess the physical, we can just look at the lines that we have from the survey that Brian did, and the information that he got from the PUC, I think, and just try to match it up roughly that way. But again, it's the same data issue we have with the subscribers. We don't know who's subscribed and who's not, or even, I mean, we could probably get a pretty good idea, but I don't think it wouldn't be 100%, but that's probably okay.
Well, we have a little bit of data from the fact that you're getting, say it's $30,000 in your franchise fee. If that's 5% of the gross take for Spectrum on just the cable, we could probably come up with an approximate number of customers they have.
Yeah, the video revenue that the franchise fee is paid against is not necessarily just basic service. So,
Right.
Yeah, so that's a tough number to get to.
Yeah.
But it can get you in the ballpark. Certainly give you a pretty good idea of what Spectrum's penetration is in this market. But with regards to the 83 homes, I would think Casco Bay Associates would have that data. They came up with that number. They geocoded, streets and addresses and so forth. They didn't provide a list of addresses that broke out these 83 homes.
No.
They may have, but I don't know that it was specific, like it was 18 Sable Lane.
Right.
Just
right,
that Sable Lane isn't served.
right.
Yeah, so it's probably close enough.
Easier to get to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll ask Brian about that number and see if he can shed some more light, give some more information, and potentially get us a list of addresses. But I think we could probably do the same thing too, because we have this similar GIS software, and we could just look at the roads that aren't served and do a buffer and copy and get the address information. So that is possible, Catherine. I think it might take a little bit of work, but we can get there, I think.
So Patrick, I know one of the things that you had asked, and we had all agreed that we would meet together without Brian first to go over your report, which is a fantastic report full of really useful information. So thank you for doing this. I understand far more about broadband and how service is delivered and works than I have from anything else I've done. So this was
good.
This was great. But what would we be looking for Brian to do with this report?
I mean, my opinion at this point, after walking through it, probably nothing other than to give his opinion. Either affirm or, push back on some of the assumptions, but I'm not sure that helps us right now until, some course of action is mapped out, right? Then I think this gets resurrected. But, unless you want Brian to go through and just, confirm these numbers, these break-even points, because, to me, that's where the rubber meets the road. I don't think he's looked at the franchise agreement. Um, You know,
Right, because he wasn't directed to.
right.
Everybody
right.
basically didn't want to go in that direction, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's your call, but at this point, I don't know if there's anything can provide. I think the only variance from his report is, hey, what would a multi-provider, open network model look like? But I'd be, certainly happy to go over it with him, or if you want to send it to him and have him respond. I don't know what his fees are, but
Well, he may want to speak with you about it anyway, because I think he did have an interest in talking with you about the field generally, I guess is the way he put it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth having you discuss this with him and just see what the, put it in a full context. And maybe, the idea of the open network was floated a few times at the WKLC BA meetings, but it didn't get a lot of traction, and I'm not entirely sure why. It may have been something to do with the complexity of the billing, which you pointed out as probably the only one real issue that has compared to the otherwise it's a better model than a single provider, pretty apparently, I think. But anyway, I'm not sure why that didn't get more traction, but I'd be curious to know, if that's a possibility and if it might be a better possibility for us. I do know that from what I've heard anyway, that there are different equipment needs, and the equipment might be a bit more costly to have those switches or whatever communicates between the various providers. But and that once you go one direction or the other, you have to kind of stick that way, as far as I understand it. So, but yeah, long story short, it'd be great if you were able to talk with Brian about this. I think
Okay.
anyway. Yeah.
And I think that's what we were looking for from this meeting, was for us to hear this and then decide, is it worth the expense? Which I agree with Eric. It's $175 an hour. And I think we could give him a maximum to go over this, Eric, so he doesn't, put in 10 hours without us realizing what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
He doesn't do things that way anyway, but yeah, I think that it's really worthwhile. My recollection from that conversation with the group was that there aren't that many network providers in Maine, so there probably really wouldn't be competition. And we did get a communication back. Someone from the group got a communication back from Charter that really came right out and said, we're not doing anything in rural areas. We're definitely not doing anything in your rural area. So we don't really need to meet, but if you want to get together and talk, we can. So
yeah, that was Mount Vernon or Vienna, and they are taking them up on that. And I'm trying to get in on that discussion because I do want to hear what's being offered to some of those other communities, which are in a much better position, I think, to get different and better service than we are, by the way. But I'm very curious as to what they're going to have to discuss when it comes down to it. But
right, and then again, Spectrum Leeds is the only one who's been making any progress out of the 6 towns, and I think, Eric, that's something we need to discuss on the select board level right away, how we want to proceed with getting Spectrum to honor the agreement, whether it involves legal counsel or just you, or getting Patrick or someone involved who, knows some of the language to advise us on how to proceed. But I think that's something we could really offer to the residents of town.
yeah, it might be the end stop too, depending on how things go. So I think that you're right. The sooner we can get that discussion started, the better off we're going to be.
And where we are having funding coming into town to use for broadband, there's no, we have an idea that we want to spend it on getting the engineering phase done of the fiber to the home network so that we can have a cost. So we can say, wow, this is never going to work, or wow, this might really work. And hey, the federal government just threw in another $2 million to Reed Field. that might change the way we look at this.
Mhm.
So I think we need to kind of keep all of our irons in the fire, but not be ridiculous with spending. So if we can get stuff out of Spectrum, I think that's fantastic.
I
Yeah.
think the other part of this is they set up the broadband in the state with that, whatever they call it, the new state agency, and
Right.
they're gonna divvy out money to the people that don't have broadband or don't have internet service. So if we're waiting in that line, we may be 5 down the road before we even get looked at.
Yeah, I read the article and agree. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of layers involved in that. So it's not really clear if the state is going to control all the funding coming from the federal government and they're going to disperse it to the communities. But based on that article, they're just beginning to form a board. So that, if you think a 5-6 community coalition is going to take a while, that one could take a while too. A while.
Yeah, and I think you have a bullet point somewhere in here that basically said we're probably not going to get any grant funding, and that's I completely agree with that. I think it's very clear that all the priority, all the funding is going to be going to areas that are unserved or grossly underserved, and we're just not in that category. We're I think, in my opinion, underserved to some extent, but we're not anywhere as close to some of these other communities around us.
Well, there's the language in the new stimulus funding is still not clearly known, and believe it or not, it was one of those, we'll write it after we voted in. So there's a lot of it's just being written. So we don't know if, for instance, that even though Refield may not qualify as underserved broadband, there may be some stipulations or provisions in that language that would allocate funding to schools and libraries and community centers, for instance, Wi-Fi hotspots, right? There could be something in the language when it's all said and done, but everything that I'm hearing is they're not expecting that language to be wordsmithed out until August, maybe later.
Well, it's not real money, so they don't really need real words either. So it's all money they're going to make.
Yeah. So it's, and, again, I'm not, Eric, I don't know if you know anything more, but is the state going to control all the allocation of that funds, or?
Yeah, I don't know anything more on that. I wish I did. Yeah,
All right.
I wouldn't venture a guess either.
So let me do this. Let me dig deeper in the franchise agreement on the iNet and the service to the schools, library, and municipal facilities, just to get better understanding of that. And Eric, are you going to reach out to Casco Bay Associates?
Yeah, I will. I'll reach out to Brian. I'll do that. I have a note here. Try to get better understanding of what the current dollar threshold would be for the Spectrum low income option. And I think also working with Catherine on trying to find out more about the Spectrum, how we might approach dealing with and working to leverage Spectrum to get some more out of that agreement.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got to find the right people or person to talk to in Spectrum that understands we're not going away, and telling us, no, we're not going to do that isn't going to fly.
No point having a franchise agreement if that's the case.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So I would make a suggestion, Dan, since we're after 8 o'clock already, that we not talk about the survey questions, because I want to change them now that we've had this discussion.
Okay. Sounds reasonable.
Yeah. And Eric, I think you just had a real short update that you had sent out in a separate email today about the update.
Yeah, well, it was just I sent out the that multi-town pro forma document, basically showing the direction that the towns were heading in, that we were looking to work collaboratively to have independent pro formas done for each municipality, and then have a group pro forma done so that the members of the WKLCBA could do, a comparison between, well, here's what it's going to cost me if I do it independently. Here's what it's going to cost me if I do it as a part of this group, and it's approximate. And I think that what you've helped provide tonight, Patrick, is going to help with that as well. I'm planning on sharing that with a group as also, so they can see a different perspective on it. But yeah, so we did, as Catherine said, have a bit of a time getting moving forward. We had started talking about an interlocal agreement, and people got bogged down in the details about well, what do we do if somebody wants to leave? And that pretty much shot everything to hell right there. And so it really did make it evident that we were going to have to be approaching this on very much a step-by-step basis. And I kind of took a step in that direction and just said, well, let's just do this first piece first. We'll look at this interlocal piece later. We'll focus right now on getting this first level assessment done, and then everybody has to go to their town meetings and talk about getting direction on if people are even interested in doing municipal fiber or fiber to the home, same as Reedfield is. So we're all kind of going together in the same direction, but as you mentioned, it's taken a long time. I mean, I've been actively involved with this for about 2 years now with the WKLCBA, and it's taken a lot of different directions, most of them lateral, a couple of them backwards. We've moved forward. We're at a much better point now than we were before. We're aware of a lot more, but some towns have been doing this for 3 years. It's a very complicated issue, as you all know, and so taking that and compounding it with the 6-town consortium, or five or six, depending on how you do the how you look at it, it's not easy, and it will continue to take time. What we're looking at right now is a process whereby each of the towns, once we get through this financial pro forma, if we have town meeting votes that aren't affirmative to heading that direction, or we have other results, such as the work of this broadband committee that puts us in a different direction, then people can drop off or will drop off. Once we get, I'd say, through June, and we know better what people have for perspectives from their communities, be it financial or even just a straw poll vote like what Reedfield's doing, we can then talk more about the engineering piece. We are looking to have Brian and Casco Bay give us more complete estimates of what the engineering piece of this would look like for a cost. So I think in his original pro forma, he'd said it was probably going to be $60,000 or $80,000 for the town of Reedfield. That would get revised, one final time, so that the towns can at some point decide whether we want to move forward with a group engineering proposal. And one thing I want to point out is I've had a few discussions with a few people recently about the idea of engineering, and trying to explain what that is, again, without having a full knowledge myself, that it seems to be much more of an inventory process of inventorying poles and inventorying, the connection points that exist around us and things like that, more so than a technical, more technical engineering type study, which is what people think about. And I think that what Brian is proposing to move forward with for an RFP for the consortium or as independent towns is just that more basic level of engineering and design. And then once we get to that point, we can shop that to the potential providers, right? The people that might do the construction for us, and the people that might do the management of the system for us. And so we're having to just, push this stuff out and take it step by step. And that is a concern for me, because the further down the road we get without having some kind of, a connection, glue, interlocal agreement, whatever it is, I think the more challenging it's going to be. But it also gives more freedom, which is what most of these towns want, is the freedom to make independent choices. But they all want to save money, and they all want to work together to do that. So there's some competing things happening there, and I'd say that's probably about where we are right now. We've agreed to move forward without any kind of formal agreement for at least a few more months. And one thing we did agree on without question was that nobody wanted a utility district. Nobody wanted another taxing authority that would have independent bonding ability and things like that. That's completely off the table as far as I understand it. But some kind of interlocal agreement, or the formation of some kind of 501c3 seem to be possibilities out there. But again, a lot of work to do to even get close to that.
And the
What's wrong with
cost-
utility districts? Dan and I both run utility districts.
Well, we like you guys, but we just don't like people are afraid because of KRDA. First Park
Oh,
has people just
man.
completely against the idea. And it's also the county and the schools coming in and taxing us and raising 6% a year and all that. That's where it comes from, Brian. I'm not saying it's justified.
Oh, that's all right. No, it's just both, body blow.
the piece that Eric sent to you folks is, I think it's $1,800 to $2,400 for the group pro forma. And that's being paid out of funds of the WK's, whatever, that the group already has. So it's not costing the town any more than we might have already contributed. So we were in favor of doing that to get a bit more firm figures. And then, of course, the survey, Eric actually bought a Survey Monkey subscription, premium subscription for the town now that is annual. That was pretty cheap, $328, I think, which we can use for multiple things in town, and start getting some better feedback from people. I think in this new digital age, and even if it's post-pandemic, which I hope we get to soon, I think it'll still be a great tool for us to get information on lots of different town issues. And it'll help us a lot in this project. So that'll be multifaceted.
Curious what people think about utility districts all of a sudden.
It was
So
the first thing that we went to for the discussion point, but then it became incredibly clear that was going to blow everything up immediately. So it's a good model. It's a good model. But anyway,
do we think we want to meet again in 2 weeks or in a month? I think I want to send the survey out prior to then. But I don't mind sending it out to you guys to look at and give feedback on just via email, on an if you're interested basis. I don't really see a need to meet just to go over that unless you folks do, and then that would be fine.
I'm liking 2 weeks out, but that's just my perspective on it.
Seems like we're gonna have Patrick and Brian have a conversation, and then once they've had the opportunity to do that, then meet. Does that make sense? Or is
I was thinking the same thing, but maybe on the calendar for 2 weeks out. So, we drive to that date. I don't know what Brian's availability is, but Eric, when you reach out to him, you'll set the limit on the number of hours. Free to have him reach out to me. I'll schedule something with him, but can he do it within, a week or 2 weeks but if we have something on the calendar, at least, hold the date.
Exactly.
I
Let's
think
set it up
yeah.
for 2 weeks. And if we have to cancel it, we can cancel it, obviously.
Right. Eric, is 2 weeks out a comp plan meeting for you?
Let me look. Keep forgetting I've got a computer in front of me. That's right. I can't. Okay, here we go. Let's see. got to get out of the full
So
screen.
that would be the 12th.
Huh, okay, it says I can't minimize Zoom while I'm recording the meeting. So I will check into that. But I expect Brian will want to get in touch with you pretty promptly. I'm fairly certain he can do that within the next 2 weeks, and I'll certainly advocate for that.
I think you're all clear on the comp plan because the solid waste committee couldn't meet on the third Wednesdays of the month
Yeah,
because that was your
yep.
comp plan.
That's right, it's
So
the
if this
third
is
Wednesday.
the second Wednesday, we should be good.
Yep.
Sorry to know your schedule.
No, that's okay. This is a pitfall of not having paper calendars on the wall anymore. I just can't, yeah. All right,
Yeah, I
very
have
good.
both. So we're all set on that. Was the public comment, is there anybody that received any feedback at all publicly through emails or anything? That was the main reason of that topic on there.
I asked one guy, I said, hey, do you have broadband at your house? He's like, what the hell's broadband? Never mind. Probably
Internet that's not your cell phone.
it's not, yeah, he did. He had a cable connection, but it was an interesting question because he's a seasonal resident. So I didn't know if they availed themselves, and of course they do. So
Well, that's good to know for a survey. You got to explain what it is you're asking people for.
yep.
Got to know your audience.
True, yeah. Not everybody's up on the jargon.
And he may have been messing with me too. So nobody ever messes with me. It's so rare. So rare.
Patrick, I just want to thank you again for all the work that you've done. I know that must have taken a lot of time, and you're a busy person and you were not well in the middle of that, and it's really appreciated.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm
thank
glad
you.
it was helpful.
I am so glad you live in Reedfield, man. That was excellent. Seriously. That was really good. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Yes, good information.
All right, well, you're welcome. So Eric, when you reach out to Brian, are you going to attach this document? Or is it something you want me to provide him? Just stipulate it in your email. That way we don't kind of stumble over each other.
Yeah, no, I will. I think I actually included it in the email, and he was included in one of the emails. So I think he probably already has a copy of it actually. But I'll just talk to him about it, and yeah, I'll set probably a 2-hour limit. You think that's reasonable?
I think that's more than reasonable, yeah.
Yep. All right, great. Well, I'll take care of that and make sure that he has all the information he needs, and we'll go from there.
Okay,
Motion to adjourn, I guess, if you get nothing else.
So moved.
Seconded by, there we go. All those in favor?
I can't vote, but I'm voting anyway.
Yeah, I see all the hands. It's unanimous.
Well, thanks everybody. It's been a great discussion.
all right. Have a
Okay,
great
thank
evening.
you, guys.
And I
Night.
Good night.